You want to eat all that food? Orders and small things. I was just up to telling you up to hearing you that I didn't have anything to do with it tonight. So the book of Judges can be read, but it's an excellent study. We'll see some of that in a moment. So, as is my normal
it's what?
It was you?
Yeah, it was me.
People accuse anybody for the
Judge will be coming.
But one of our unnamed deacons was responsible for that accidental phone call. So typically, to me, it helps understand a book if I can put a good theme to it, give me kind of an overall picture. So we have several good suggestions in the book. Basically, the idea behind the book, or at least a major section of it, is that God uses unlikely people. So if you look at the actual judges themselves in chapters 3 through 16, we're going to see some highly unlikely people that God calls on to do what He wants them to do. And even though they're unlikely, they're still faithful, and that's what makes them successful as leaders of Israel. So you could also take what I think is the actual main verse in the book, which you can find in chapter 17, 18, 19, and the very end of chapter 25, which was, in those days there was no king in the land, so every person did what was right in his or her own eyes. So that to me is the main verse in the book, the theme verse. And it does cover all of chapter 17 through 25. But the book is larger than those two ideas. God does call the unlikely in chapters 3 through 16. And people were living out in their own rebellion in chapters 17 through 25. But because it just fits with one section of the book, I didn't think it told me what the book was trying to accomplish overall. So for me, the best overall picture is a faithful God working with broken people. That's the theme I've settled on. Now, we're going to get back to that in a minute. But basically, I've seen lots of different books out there that are based on this. Tim Keller has one called The Flawed and the Flawless. It's basically got that same idea to it, that our flawless God is still working with flawed people like you and me. Right? So the book of Judges highlights that, and it really does from chapter 1 all the way through the end of the book of chapter 25. idea that we have a faithful God, and He chooses to work with people who aren't always at their best. And that really does fit with the whole book. So yes, God does call unlikely people. Yes, God is working with a rebellious people. So I combine those two different ideas, into a faithful God and a broken people. So we've already mentioned our main verse, which you can again find in chapter 17, 18, 19, and 25. In fact, it's the last verse of the book. In those days there was no king in the land, so each person did what was right in his own eyes. That is the main verse of the book. But turn to chapter 3 real quick, and we'll see the main concept of the book. Switch one of the glasses. So in chapter 3, beginning in verse 7, this is the first judge. This is the cycle that we're going to see over and over throughout the book. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Ashtaroths. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that He sold them into the hands of Rishathaim, king of Aram and Ram, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, He raised up for them a deliverer. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, and he saved them. Now we'll stop there. That already gives us the cycle that we're looking for. And you can put these at any point on the map, but to me it works better as a circle. You've got Israel's disobedience. God punishes them. After some time, which is usually a long amount of time, in this passage, 8 years, they get tired of being punished. So they cry out to God and say, "We are so sorry. Please come help us." You know, like in the movie, "Help us, we don't know what we're doing out here," right? God sends them a deliverer, a rescuer, often referred to as a judge in the book. Not every single time, but that's where the name of the book comes from. He delivers Israel, or she does, and they go back to being faithful to God. Then the cycle starts all over. They walk away from God. He punishes them. They suffer. They get tired of suffering. They call out to God. He delivers them. They walk away from God. He gets angry at them. They suffer. They call out to God. He delivers them. And so you can just keep going around and around on that cycle. And the book of Judges is like second verse, same as the first. Only the second verse is always worse. So in our mind, we think of it in a cycle, but you can almost think of it in a downward spiral, because the book just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and the people just keep getting worse. And yet, God, through His infinite grace, continues to work with them. So, the theme of the book, or the purpose of the book, you have two different kinds of purposes. One, it fills the chronological gap from Moses and Joshua up to Samuel, basically. Technically, Moses is the first judge. He's referred to that in that regard as in Exodus 18, I think it is. And we know for a fact that Samuel is the last judge. He is referred to that way in 1 Samuel chapter 7. So the period of Judges is larger than the book of Judges. The period of Judges goes from Moses all the way to Samuel. The book covers between Joshua and Eli. But Eli was also a judge. Some of them were prophets. Deborah was a prophet. Moses was a prophet. Samuel was a prophet. Eli was a prophet. Some of them were not prophets. Joshua was not a prophet. Othniel was not a prophet. Ehud was not a prophet. He's not that we know. We're not told that they were. But what we're all told is that they were leaders of a nation. But not like a king. How do you know a king is different from another kind of leader? What makes a king different than another kind of leader? Absolute. Absolute power, for one thing, yes. That's what Samuel tells him. Look, if he wants your donkey, he's going to take your donkey. If he wants your wife, he's going to take your wife. And so that's absolute power.
What? DNA, blood.
All right, family lineage
Yeah.
is the main one that the Bible is.
Yeah.
Almost doesn't the first one. That when David dies, one of the sons is going to become king, unless God chose. When that son dies, one of his sons is going to become king, and so on and so forth down the line. It's a lineage. But in Judges, especially like Gideon, for instance, who goes by the name actually Jerubbaal in the book. He's only called Gideon a very few times, but that's the name we know him by. But his contemporaries all called him Jerubbaal. So they didn't even call him Gideon. In chapter 8, he says, I'm not going to let my children rule over you. And take chapter 8, verse 36, maybe. He says, your only sovereign is God. Now, from the time of Moses all the way up through Samuel, that is the consistent message that comes from the prophet or from God himself. I'm your sovereign. You don't need a king. And so when they try to make Gideon a king, he says, no. And not only that, none of my children are going to be king. Because God alone is our sovereign. So let me back up a little bit. What was the first system God placed to have a relationship with human beings? In Eden, God planted a garden.
What did you say?
In Eden, God planted a garden. And it was in the garden that he first related to Adam and Eve. He walked with them. He talked with them. They had a one-to-one relationship with God. But that didn't last long. You can take your debate on that. 5 decades, 5 generations. I'm more like 5 minutes. They decided to run away from God and do their own thing. We call that sin, right? So the garden idea did not work because God's idea wasn't going to be successful. Did he know it was not going to be successful? Yes. And so that's why we refer to things as the scheme or plan of redemption. God always knew that the garden wasn't going to work and we were going to mess that up. So the next thing he tried was the patriarchs. God started dealing with heads of family, like Noah, or Moses, so on and so forth. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Did the system of the patriarchs work out all that well? That's why they were in Egypt in slavery for 430 years, because they were stiff-necked and rebellious, and they did not follow their fathers, and they certainly did not follow their father God. So God says, okay, I'll scrap that system. I'll give you the law. But under the law, the first thing I'm going to do is give you a temporary leader, a judge, a prophet. And that's where we are in that system. How well is this system going to work out? Of all the systems, this one's the worst. As bad as it was what Adam and Eve did, as bad as what happened during the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what happens under the judges is terrible. It is the worst of systems as we read it from the human perspective. The rebellious hearts of broken people made for horrible, horrible stories. If you've ever read the book of Judges, your first question is going to be, what in the world is this this point in the Bible. And then once we start reading, your next question is going to be, and why are we studying it in class? Because it is horror. I mean, if you turn it into headlines, it would be worse than Salacious. It couldn't even be printed today as a headline format in a major newspaper. They would forego it. The stories that are in the book of Judges are absolutely horrendous. So, what is it in the Bible and why are we studying? Because the Bible is not meant to be a book of virtues. Never perfect. It's not meant to be those warm and fuzzy stories that make us feel all encouraged. It's never meant to be that. Because people are creatures like that. Ta-da! What's our probably one of our top 5 favorite verses in the whole New Testament is Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There is none righteous, not even one. That's our favorite verse for a good reason. It's true. And the book of Judges is that in spades. The book of Judges proves Romans 3:23 is very, very true. So we've had the law, the judges are the first leader, that doesn't work. He brings about kings, that doesn't work out so well. I mean, even the best of them had some pretty bad days, right? Then he brings about the prophets. Then they get carried off into captivity. And finally, he tries to scrap the law altogether. He does scrap the law altogether, and he nails it to the cross. But he nails it to the cross on the back of his own son. But you don't have to wait to the cross to see God's gracefulness or His great mercy, because in the book of Judges, despite the cycle happening over and over and over again, and despite people getting worse and worse and worse, each time God says, you deserve punishment, but I'm going to pull you out of the fire. Each and every time God says, I still love you, I will still fight for you. You are still my people. So ultimately, the book of Judges is about God's infinite mercy. And I find that extremely encouraging. That'll be up to your decision. I don't personally think I'm near as bad as some of these folks. So if you think that, it's still okay, because even if I am every bit as bad as some of these folks, God's never been as good as He was to them. Even more so. If He was good to them, how much more is He going to be good to us? Isn't that what Romans 5 teaches us? God did not spare His own Son, but willingly gave Him up for us all. How will He not also, along with Him, graciously now give us all things? So I firmly believe that the book of Judges belongs in the Bible, and I firmly believe it's every bit of something worth studying and worth challenging us, because we have to decide for ourselves, am I going to live out that constant cycle? First of all, where am I on that cycle? And do I want to stay there, or do I want to get in a close relationship with God and try to maintain that? Because you don't have to keep going through the cycle. There's no rule that says, just because you're in a relationship with God, you have to blow it. That's the devil's lie. You don't have to blow it. We just choose to. But what God wants is for us to be in a good, loving relationship with Him and stay there. So that's my introduction to the book of Judges. There's way more we could do. I can't type and talk at the same time. All right, so we'll find out where we're at here. Let me put this slide up. I kind of mentioned the basic outline of the book already. But chapters 1 and 2 kind of fill out the prologue of the book. They're kind of like the introduction of the book. Chapters 3 through 16 are the major section of the book. There, each of the judges are being listed. And chapters 17 through 25 is achronological. It's just different stories about how bad Israel really was. It centers on three chief areas. Their religion in the first few chapters, 17, 18, and 19. Okay. Then it focuses after that on their moral illness, even within the home. That's chapter 19.
Then chapter 17, Bill.
Yeah, we're just breaking up the sections.
Okay.
So chapters 1 and 2 is kind of like an introduction. It does the same kind of thing Genesis does. You know how it gets the creation and then it goes back to chapter 2 and kind of recaps the creation all over again. Judges does the same thing. It gives you that what's going on those first few years after Joshua, and then basically goes back and says, don't think everything was good, because it gives you the good side of chapter 1, and it gives you the bad side of chapter 2. So chapters 1 and 2, I mean, you could title those Israel's shaky time after Joshua dies, or something like that. How quickly Israel, runs into trouble after Joshua's strong leadership. Okay. Then chapters 3 through 16 are the stories of the judges from which the book gets its name. And they're just consecutive stories about the different deliverers. I don't know, it doesn't tell us whether they're all chronological or not, because some of the judges could have operated at the same time because they're operating in different parts of the country and they're from different tribes. So some of them could have run concurrently. They don't have to run consecutively. So we really can't get a time factor from that, but it is certain stories about 12 different judges, which I don't find accidental that there are 12 of them, given the fact that there are 12 tribes of Israel. I think it's just 12 stories selected about 12 judges that just happen to illustrate the condition of Israel during this time period, from Joshua to Samuel. And then the last section of the book, chapter 17 through 25, is basically just a string of moral failures within Israel. They center around religion, their home life, different aspects of Israelite culture and how depraved they are. We'll see those. There are parts of the book before that that are bad, but 17 through 25 is going to make you uncomfortable if you've never read it before. I mean, it's really bad.
What chapter?
Chapter 17 through 25 is the last section of the book. And it's just in there to show just how bad people were under the leadership of the judges. But we don't know chronologically when that section happened. They're not tying it to the time or lifetime of a specific judge. They're just saying this is the kind of stuff that went on during this time period. We're talking basically, give or take, 300 to 400 years, since we don't know all the chronology. It's a little difficult. But somewhere between, it starts, depending on when you want to date Joshua's death, it starts somewhere between 1400 and 1350 BC, and then somewhere, 1050 to 1000 BC. That's the period we're talking about. Basically 300 to 400 years. I opt for closer to 300, but we don't really know, so everybody gets their own guess on that. What we do know is it was several hundred years that Israel didn't have a king. They didn't have Moses, they didn't have Joshua, they had lesser, smaller leaders that weren't as well equipped and weren't as faithful to God's calling, although some of them grew to be faithful. Even those that were faithful were rejected and treated horribly by their own generation. And so as soon as they died, guess what happened? Israel slipped right back into their own ways of being disobedient and disrespectful. So that's kind of the basic gist of the book. It divides easily into three sections, is what I'm saying. An introduction in chapters 1 and 2, the judges in chapters 3 through 16, and then just some loosely associated stories of just how bad people could be. Traditionally, most people say that the prophet Samuel wrote the book. We don't know that for a fact, so I would, I wouldn't put since you can't put a chapter and verse on that, you just gotta be gracious to people who disagree with it. But I'm fine with an example. I think it's also highly likely that Eli wrote it. Given some of what he says to his sons, which sounds like stuff right out of the book of Judges, because Eli kept trying to persuade his sons to be obedient. But when they were disobedient, he just let them go. He challenged them verbally, but he never made them obey. And that sounds to me like some of you might have written the book of Judges. So, let's start looking at chapter 22, which time we have left tonight, just 20 minutes. And because we're on the microphone here, I will just go ahead and read tonight, and we'll see if we can't do something else for next Wednesday night. Next Wednesday night, we'll take some other readers, but we'll make sure everybody knows where we're going to start so that they can have their Bibles ready to go. Judges chapter 1. Now after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who will be the first to go up and fight for us against the Canaanites? I promised myself I wouldn't do this, but I just can't let some of these verses go. If your leader dies, what's the first question you would probably ask? Who's going to be our next leader? Isn't it telling right here in chapter 1, verse 1, that's not what they asked? They don't care who the next leader is. They want the next goodie. Who's going to win the next battle? What does that tell you about how they ultimately felt about Moses and then Joshua? Well, we already know how they felt because the books are full of it. How do they treat Moses as a leader? Yeah, disrespecting is putting it very good. Yes, when we got what we wanted, we were fine with it. When we didn't get what we wanted, we blamed him.
Bill,
Yes.
in Joshua, lost my place.
Sorry. When Moses died, who picked Joshua? When Moses died, who made Joshua the leader? Who voted him in? God did. When Joshua died, who did God vote in? Nobody, because they weren't listening anyway. He just gave them what they wanted, which was nothing. So be careful. Those strong leaders aren't always easy to like. That's a fact of life. If you like them real well, they're probably not a very good president, or elder, or it's not meant to be a popular position. Leadership in the kingdom of God, leadership anyway, is meant to be popular. Not there to be good friends. Do not. That doesn't mean you can't be friendly. But if you are trying to be a teacher and a friend at the same time, it's a matter of days before you are on your knees begging to be fired. I just think it's interesting right out of the gate here. So then Judah said to Simeonites, their brothers, come up with To make a long story short, they attack, they have a lot of victories. Now, some preachers will look at this verse and say, God said Judah was to go, and they didn't go on their own, and that was a sin. Maybe. And Joshua, what were the tribes told to do? Work together. So let's say a 4-6. Somebody look that up. So that means, right after, anybody find it? Karen, you got it?
No, I've been others.
Okay, you got property, everybody else follow me for that. Hosea 4:6 shows it.
My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because they have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priest for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children.
Great summary for the whole picture. Because you forgot me, I will forgive you and that's the cycle we see. Proverbs 29:18, Jamie.
Where there is no revelation, people cast off restraint, but blessed is the one who gives wisdom.
People throw off their. But when they did it, what happened pretty quickly? Well, depends on the story, but you had stories like snakes coming in among the encampment and biting 115,000.